I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian with Heritage Mississauga. And today we're going to try something a little new for us, and we're going to record a presentation. And we're going to start doing these as part of our programs here at Heritage Mississauga. So a way for us to explore the fascinating aspect of the history of Mississauga and a variety of different topics. And what better way to start than kind of wandering down memory lane and taking a look at some of the historic estates and the grand houses. Some of which still survive, some of which are no longer with us, but that help make up the story of Mississauga. And so again, thank you for joining us here with Heritage Mississauga. And our presentation today there we go. Sorry, new technology. Mind Your Manors, Historic Estates of Mississauga. There's a wonderful book written a number of years ago, and I kind of stole the title for it, called Relics of Old Decency. Now, how's that for a reference to something that recalls a bygone era and maybe a gilded age, if you will? But Mind Your Manors, the Historic Estates of Mississauga. We've broken this into different generations in terms of the eras in which they're built. And we're calling them, we have a first, second, third generation, of course, and also transition years, and some of the landmarks that were built and established that harken back to these different eras of incredible architectural construction and what it says about the society that lived at the time. Our first generation, looking between the 1820s and the 1880s. The house that kind of began it all, the first kind of settler era dwelling that was a little bit bigger than the average 12 by 20 foot log cabin, undoubtedly belonged to Brevet Major General Sir Peter Adamson. Now, how's that for a title? Add an honorable in there because he was Speaker of the Legislative Council at one point as well. So, but the Brevet Major General Sir Peter Adamson, without a doubt, the highest ranking military officer to settle in historic Mississauga. People often get a little confused what the term brevet means, and he got the battlefield rank of Major General, but the pay of the Colonel. So you get the rank without the pay, so that's the brevet as well. He was involved in the Napoleonic Wars in Spain and Portugal. He was the major, then colonel, and then major general of the Hunters Battalion. If anybody's a fan of the Sharp series, they follow the Hunters Battalion, and that was actually Peter Adamson's battalion. After the Napoleonic Wars, the British government found themselves in dire straits financially, and they offered senior officers either half pay for their commissions or land in lieu of pay, and Peter is one of those that took land. He received over 20,000 acres of land as attained to his rank, or as a result of his rank. And that land was scattered throughout Upper Canada, what is Ontario today, as far away as from Peterborough all the way down to Windsor. He had different acreages. For whatever reason, unrecorded as to why he chose it, the 400 acres in historic Mississauga is where he chose to establish himself and build a home and reside on, and that was within the Sheridan Homelands area of Mississauga today, kind of bounded today by Fifth Line, Dundas Street, Winston Churchill, and the QEW. It's kind of the area he was living in. And in 1821, he had built a rather large, someone called palatial at the time, estate for himself known as Thorn Lodge, also referred to as Toronto House, as in Toronto Township, the historic name for Mississauga. But Thorn Lodge was the common name that was used. You can find the remembrances of Thorn Lodge and Thorn Lodge Drive today in the Sheridan Homelands area. Again, the house was built in 1821, and it even had gravity-fed water. It was water that was collected in cisterns on the roof, and then the gravity-fed into the house below. This is, all his neighbors at the time were building log cabins hewn out of the wilderness. Well, here's a very large, square-shaped stone house, large enough to have a central courtyard where the militia could gather and assemble for inspection. So you're looking at a rather significant home, quite unlike those built around him. Needless to say, the grandest home of its time. Thorn Lodge had a long life from beginning in 1821 all the way until 1968, when unfortunately it was lost to fire. It was destined to actually become converted into a branch of the Sheridan Public Library after it ceased being a private home. Unfortunately, that never did come to be, and Thorn Lodge was lost to a fire in 1968. So just here's a picture of Thorn Lodge and a quote from 1881. And this is the general himself passed away in 1865. So in 1881, it's into its third owner at that point. The house shows the influence of the general service in Spain and Portugal, arranged around three sides of a court, and is quite unlike most Canadian houses of the time. Quite a remarkable building, given the era in which it was built. From there, we go to a neighbor not too far away from the general, and that was the estate of Reverend James McGraw. Now, Reverend McGraw often gets attached to the Erindale, the Grand Erindale house, the bigger one, which is the picture in the lower right. That was actually a house built by his son William. The general's house is the one that appears, or the minister's house is the one that appears in the top left. Incidentally, they were both lost to fire. In 1867, the first house was lost to a fire. It was replaced by an even grander house in 1867, and it too was lost to fire in 1920. Erindale was and hence the community of Springfield. Later, Springfield on the credit renamed itself Erindale in 1900. In association with this significant property which stood in where the Credit Woodlands is today. So the name for the community Erindale comes from the Erindale estate. It literally means Ireland in the valley, Erin in the dale. And that's where Reverend James McGraw himself came from. So grand old Erindale, the stories of grand garden parties hosted by Anna Cordelia McGraw. The house burned, the grand house, Grand Old Erindale, burned on June 12, 1920, while it was owned by the Price family of Price Dairy Farm. Incidentally, the first dairy farm in Canada produced pasteurized milk was right here in historic Mississauga. And much like the first house, they were both struck by lightning. And so there's a picture of the ruins of Grand Old Erindale. And this is within what is now the Credit Woodlands area of the city of Mississauga. So Erindale was gone, the house, by 1920, but of course the name itself lives on. From there we go to Clair House. If you're driving into Cooksville today along Dundas Street or here in Ontario, you might see Welcome to Cooksville Village signs that depict an artist's rendition of what was Clair House, and that's the picture in the top right corner there. We actually only have one photograph of Clair House, a couple of paintings, but one photograph, and that's the photo in the top left. And you can just make out the trellises and the wraparound veranda on Clair House in that picture. The picture features on the left Sir Melville Parker, the older gentleman, kind of slouched down. His daughter and his granddaughter, as well as his son-in-law, are pictured there on a settee underneath the grand veranda of Clair House. Clair House was built in 1841 and stood until 1932. Not great with math, but just not too shy of 100 years of age. It was most famous for being in association with the Canadian Vine Growers Association under the direction of Justin de Courtenay, and of course Sir Melville Parker. The Canadian Vine Growers Association operated from the 1860s until about 1925, and they produced wine from this property called Clair House wines. There's a couple of vague references to Clair House being established by Johann Schiller, and later owners include Solomon White and the Remugis family, as well as being a rabbit farm towards the end of its lifetime. It attained the kind of vernacular terminology of Chateau Clair, which was not really something that was used during its existence. It seems to have come about either towards the end of its life or after it had already been lost in kind of its name association, kind of giving it even grander perspective at the time. But given the era in which it was built, 1841, Clair House was quite a grand home of the time, befitting that of the Parkers, who were a very wealthy, landed, aristocratic family, very involved in local politics at the time. There's one of the only interior shots we have of Clair House, and Some fantastical looking, I'm assuming it's a stove given the pipes that come from it, but never quite seen one of those before. But you look at the the extensive drawing room here and the built-in cabinetry and stuff. This is considering it's built in 1841, this is a home quite unlike most of its neighbors. A grand estate with grand aspirations, and of course most connected with the Ontario Vine Growers Association and Clair House wines for at least a short period of time in its history. Sticking with the Parker family, another house known as Harbourne House originally and later renamed as Craigmyle House. This stood just off of Harbourne Road, south of Dundas Street off of here, Ontario. You'll find a reference to Harbourne Road today, spelt a little differently. It's Harborn. It's dropped the U and the E in time, but the road remembers the house that is no longer. The house was built in 1845 by Sir Melville Parker's brother, and that was Sir Henry Parker. The only picture we have of Harbourne, later Craigmyle, is from a distance. You can see in the big picture there, stretching into the background. There's Grand Harbourne House. The house was purchased in 1872. Didn't really leave the family. Lieutenant Commander Andrew Robertson Gordon married into the Parker family and purchased this property from his wife's uncle, they renamed it Craigmyle after his birthplace in Scotland. So Craigmyle becomes a name associated. Now, if you're looking on an atlas and you look out west into Alberta, you're going to find Craigmyle, Alberta, founded by the same family. After they left historic Mississauga, they went west, and so Craigmyle, Alberta, has connections to Craigmyle House by name and by family association here in historic Mississauga, what was Cooksville. It was, believe it or not, later used as a gambling house, and sometime after in the 1960s, the house was demolished. We don't have an exact date of the demolition of the house. Its actual location was just off of Sherrowby, across the road from Harbourne Street, but nonetheless, the house, the name recalls this earlier estate home of Harbourne and later Craigmyle. There's a picture of Harbourne and a description of it from the 1890s. A grand house of 20 rooms, exquisitely decorated, befitting an established gentleman. Now, how's that for a terminology of a relic of old decency, if you will? And just one of the only interior shots we have really does speak to the grandeur. Look at the size of the painting that's on the wall in the background. And the chandelier, quite unlike, again, probably many of its neighbors, harkening back to the elegance of Clair House, would have had something in common with the structure of this building. From there, we go to Benares, a house that many of us may be familiar with, given that it does remain on our landscape today. The house was built in 1857. It's the second home of the Harris family, and today, of course, it survives as a museum, part of the Museums of Mississauga Benares Historic House, interpreted back to the First World War time period. But again, Benares was originally built in 1857. It's the second home after the first one was lost to fire of the Harris family. It's probably its most claim to fame in terms of local association is that with famed Canadian author Maison de la Roche. You will find a plaque from Parks Canada on the property commemorating the family association between the Harris family and the famed author Maison. And the house, of course, today is a museum. And one of the fascinating things is you can walk into that house today and really get transported back to the life and times, or the times of the Harris family themselves. Again, the house, along with all of the artifacts, were donated by the descendants of the Harris family, and now home to the Museums of Mississauga. One of there are two locations in the city, or three locations in the city, I should say. Benares is a wonderful landmark and a kind of a way to kind of step back into the elegance of an upper middle class family from the First World War time period. Of course, with roots that go back even longer than that, but quite a remarkable element. And this is simply one room in the house, resplendent with even a player piano. Another house that is no longer with us is known as Gortmerron, or later the Greyshur House. This house was built in 1856. It was located down towards the water treatment facility that's at the foot of Southdown Road, where it turns westward on Lakeshore Road, kind of that south bend, not too far from the Petro-Canada property or the refinery lands. The house was built in 1856 by Reverend George Evans, who was a minister out of Oakville, later sold to Henry Schofield, and then to the Gooderham family of the Gooderham and Worts fame. So quite some significant wealthy families associated with this house, as befitting its architectural style and simply grandeur and size of the home itself. The property was later purchased by the Township of Toronto itself and served as Mississauga's first Parks and Recreation Department, if you can believe that. We have some pictures of it over time with the parks vehicles stretched outside. The building was finally demolished to make way for a wastewater treatment facility in 1966, and so the building is no longer, but it has striking features that kind of make it feel like it connects to things in its scale and style with the Cawthra estate and the Adams estate, things we'll meet a little bit later in our presentation. Another house, this one still with us today, at least in partial form, is that of Lislehurst, also known as the Schreiber estate. The Schreiber family, originally from the Isle of Guernsey in England, came to Toronto in the 1860s, and they were bequeathed land here in Mississauga, what is around the University of Toronto Mississauga campus today. And they built three large estate homes here, largely intended to be summer houses. The father and his two sons each built a home, and they were each given grand names. Lislehurst, Mount Woodham, and Iverholme were the names of the houses. The only one that's with us today is Lislehurst. And so built by the Schreiber family in about 1870, and again, three houses once dotted the property. And after the Schreibers had ceased to be associated with the property by the estate, it was sold to Reginald Watkins, rather eccentric a bachelor, wealthy individual in real estate in Hamilton. He purchased the property, and it kind of became his reclusive estate. And it was from the Watkins estate that the University of Toronto acquired the property through expropriation, creating the University of Toronto Erindale campus, now the University of Toronto Mississauga. Lislehurst was the only one of the three homes that survives to the present day. Iverholme, unfortunately in 1913, burned to the ground by an accidental lighting of deck boards by a farm help or a property helper on the site, and so Iverholme was lost. Mount Woodham survived alongside Iverholme, and not sure the accuracy of it, but the story is that Reginald Watkins had Mount Woodham torn down to recycle its building material and to enlarge Iverholme. And that's why Iverholme survives in part, but largely also an altered version of itself because of the extensive renovations undertaken by Reginald Watkins in the 1920s and 1930s, again, principally reusing the building material and including the window glass that had originally been in Mount Woodham. So here we see kind of the expansive rooms that are in Lislehurst, very much harkening back to that earlier time period of the elegancy of a kind of a wealthy landed family. Of course, the Schreibers are best known for Charlotte Schreiber, the first woman artist to be elected to the Royal Canadian Academy of Art. A very extensive and celebrated career as an artist from Charlotte Schreiber. Iverholme and Mount Woodham. This we have pictures of Iverholme. We do not, that we believe, have a picture of Mount Woodham, but there's Iverholme on the left before the fire in 1913 and the ruins of Iverholme after the fire of 1913. And again, Mount Woodham was demolished for building material. From there, we go to what we refer to today as the Gooderham estate, by its correct name as Rose Villa. Rose Villa was built in 1870 by Charles Hawley Gooderham, Horace Gooderham, of, again, the Gooderham and Worts family. Later owners included the artist Georges Chavignot and Major General Francis Louis Lessard, of both incredible fame and things we can talk about later are some of the people that lived in these houses as well. It's part of Meadowvale Village Heritage Conservation District, and it's now home to the Robert Glen School. You can see the rather ostentatious front porch, harkening back to, say, an American Southern plantation style. That was a later addition to the house, not during the Gooderhams. During the Gooderhams, it was a solid, stately brick home, as you can see in the top picture, but does not take away from the elegance of the structure. It makes it perhaps even a little bit more of a landmark because there's nothing else quite like it, with these two-story columns out front of the home. And again, today home to Robert Glen School. There's a picture of the family gathering under the Gooderhams inside of Rose Villa. That's Charles Hawley Gooderham with the mustache in the center of the picture, and his family around him. Doesn't show us a lot about the details of the house, but certainly the Gooderhams were a very wealthy and influential early family, both in Toronto and here in historic Mississauga and beyond. From there, we go to a estate known as Brookside or Harthill. The estate, we don't have a picture of it, just the artist's rendition of the estate house. This was built about 1880 by James Leith Ross, and there's not much we know about the house, to be honest with you. It's a little bit of a challenge to try to piece together history of it. Where it does come to play is when the Carmel sisters opened the property as a convalescent home, and they utilized the original Brookside property, estate house, made additions to it, ultimately demolished it to build the current facility that's there, which itself was going through kind of a renovation of uses and perhaps a new build on the property as well. But this is the original Brookside, or also what was known by the family as Harthill, on a hill at the corner of Mississauga Road and Dundas Street. The transition years, that's kind of the end of our first wave of major building in the community, at least in terms of the grand homes. The transition years between 1880 and 1910 saw a number of developments which would change the nature of the interactions, of social interactions within the community itself. We see a number of hotels popping up. The first one, we have Orr's Hotel in what was Lorne Park, and eventually Hotel LOUISE gets established. Edmund Burke, the famed architect, designed Hotel LOUISE in 1889 as a retreat, or what was intended to be a retreat for wealthy Toronto elite. Around it developed a Lorne Park Association, the Cottagers Association, designed to be kind of a pleasure resort and cottage park. They even had a wharf with steamer service in Toronto, and Hotel LOUISE was the centerpiece of it. It was the jewel in the crown. And so from 1889 until its untimely loss to a fire in 1920, at which point it had reverted into a very large private cottage. But Hotel LOUISE unfortunately lost to fire in 1920. Not in the same vein of attracting wealthy Toronto dwellers, those looking for kind of escapes. It's the same ideas that opened up Muskoka and beyond to those cottage mentality. But Lorne Park really geared itself to kind of attracting Torontonians out into the wilds of cottage country of historic Mississauga. The Albertonia Hotel was built in 1889 by James Albertson, renamed the Lorne Park Lodge in 1927, and itself unfortunately lost to fire in 1929. But these things, these grand hotels that once operated, even for a short period of time, kind of changed the perspective of those that engaged with this community. It brought new attention and new ideas, new wealth into the community, some of which would spill out into building the next wave of grand homes. Also along that line is the Glen Leven Hotel, and unfortunately we don't have a picture of Glen Leven, but this is the pleasure pond that once was part of the property of Glen Leven. Purchased by Lachlan Hamilton, is associated with Mississauga Golf and Country Club today. In 1902, it was a stock fishing pond for boating and golf. And the hotel itself, Glen Leven Hotel, located just off of Lorne Park Road on the north side of Lakeshore Road, burned in 1936. So we're seeing a commonality here. A lot of things are built from wood, electricity is in its infancy. A lot of things are using candles and oil lamps and the like, and so fire is ripe to happen, and many of these buildings do succumb to fire. In the second generation of buildings, between 1900 into 1935, kind of ending in the Great Depression era, sees another wave, and this is largely a wave that is in some ways attached to the hotels that came before it, kind of bringing people into the community, new ideas, new money, and new desire to live within the bounds of historic Mississauga. Glen Ireton was built in 1913 as the Robert Young Eaton's estate. Robert Young is the second president of the Eaton's Company. He's the nephew of the founder. The Glen Ireton, actually named of all things after a horse, a favorite racehorse of the family, Glen Ireton, is the name also given to the property. Robert Young Eaton, incidentally, was a known and renowned collector of art. A number of his paintings from his collection, presumably held at Glen Ireton, are now in the keeping of the city of Toronto. The house itself, the property, was 17 acres, included a main house, a coach house, greenhouses, stables, tennis courts, swimming pools, with his racehorses on property. This is quite an extensive landed property, if you will. What survives today is what's known as the coach house, and that is now a private residence, as you can see in the picture here. And if this is kind of just the outbuilding on the property, it gives you a potential idea how big the house and how grand the main house must have been. The house at the time was owned by the Bellingham family, or the Belgian family, known as Bellingham Bay, and they renamed it Bellingham Bay, and it was lost. The main house was lost to a fire in 1958. What survives is one of the approaches to the house as part of our park feature today, and you can see this on the south side of Lakeshore Road just before Balboa, and quite a beautiful park feature. But you can see the old laneway there that led to part of the Glen Ireton estate. From there, we go to a surviving house. Just off of Godfrey's Lane in Port Credit, you will find a private home today that's known as the Harbourne Estate, or officially Eden House. The house was built in 1914 as a summer home for Andrew Harbourne of the House of Harbourne Tailors, and House of Harbourne is later purchased by Tip Top Tailors, so it gives you kind of an idea of kind of the market that this fellow was in. Andrew Harbourne is a fascinating character, involved in a great deal of fundraising during the First World War. Together with his wife Alicia, hosted grand garden parties here. This is a very extensive house at the time, designed by Edward James Lennox, also associated with building in Ottawa for the government. But the house, a grand home, again built in 1914. There's a picture of the 1919 garden party held on the front lawn of Harbourne House. Harbourne House is the main house, just kind of left of center there. And this is what was known as the Return Man's Party for returning soldiers after the First World War. Again, this is taking place in August of 1919. And it was here that the Honorable Arthur Meehan, later to become Prime Minister Arthur Meehan, formerly discharged the troops as they were gathering for the demobilization and for a victory party or an ending party for the First World War. And this was a grand focal point. You can see Lake Ontario stretching into the background, and Godfrey's Lane runs between the two houses, and in the distance there is now Brookner Road at Denver Gardens. But Eden House, the Harbourne Estate, still with us today, still a private home just off of Godfrey's Lane in Port Credit. Berrymead. This property is associated with the Fudger and later the Rattray family, overlooking Rattray Marsh. The house was built in 1918 and 1919 by H.H. Fudger, later sold in 1945 to Major James Rattray, after whom Rattray Marsh is named. It was built at a time when the Fudgers had lost an earlier home to fire, and a belief that to protect themselves, they would use the newest kind of fashion of building, and that was concrete. This house was a very strong house built out of concrete, and when it was attempted to be demolished, it took several tries, including dynamite and fire, before they brought in heavy bulldozers and finally demolished the property, much against the community's wishes, by the way. But a developer that was embroiled with the city on this property decided to move quickly and demolish the house. Kind of the loss of the house raised the flashlight even more on the property, and ultimately the property is expropriated to create Rattray Marsh Conservation Area today, operated by the Credit Valley Conservation Authority. So although Berrymead is no longer with us, some elements are. There are gatehouses on both the east and west side of the property that both survive today of private homes. One of them off of Bexhill Road today, and also along Bexhill Road, you'll find the former gates to the Fudger estate, which are now part of a front lawn of a private home. But the gates remain there, and then during Rattray's time, his access was off of Meadowwood Road, and the gates on Meadowwood Road, along with its gatehouse, also survive today, a private family home. So some elements of Berrymead survive, but few. And of course, the main house itself no longer with us. And there's a grand picture of Berrymead overlooking kind of on an angle towards both Rattray Marsh and on a height of land overlooking Lake Ontario. So Berrymead, a grand house built in 1918, 1919. There's the gates to Berrymead along a private home in off of Bexhill Road, but you can find the historic gates to the old estate house itself. From there, we go to one of the most beloved properties in Mississauga. A few years ago, there was a vote online to vote for your favorite place, and the Adamson estate won it, namely the waterfront trail through the Adamson estate. Known originally by the family as simply the Grove Farm, we know it today as the Adamson estate, was built between 1918 and 1920 by Agar and Mabel Adamson. They had served in Belgium during the First World War, and had fallen in love with Flemish architecture, and so brought that inspiration back with them to build kind of the grand landed estate here in historic Mississauga. If you want to read about the life and times of a family at this moment in time, a wealthier than normal family, there's a couple of things. One's called Wasps in the Attic by Anthony Adamson, the son of Agar and Mabel. Another is letters to home from the journals of the letters of Agar Adamson writing home to Mabel during the First World War. Agar was the founding colonel of the Princess Patricia Canadian Light Infantry. Anyway, the grand home itself was built in 1918-1920, and through expropriation is now owned by the city of Mississauga, and after several years of being home to the Royal Conservatory of Music, is now home to a private school known as Blythe Academy. But the grounds themselves are generally open when we're allowed to be, and quite a fascinating history to walk through that property. Some ghost stories, pet cemetery, and other things on the property. But it's the grand houses that really draw the attention, quite unlike any other historic house built in Mississauga. And there's some aerial pictures of the property itself. You can see the approaches with the grand house and the houses and the kind of associated outbuildings that were once there. The barn is still part of property, but that's one of the few elements other than the house itself that survives. And what is known as the Folly, or the original gatehouse to the estate. This gatehouse in the bottom left there predates the main house. It actually was associated with the other house that was on the property, the first house, which was demolished when the second house was built in 1918, 1919. So the Folly itself dates to 1910, and originally this represented the driveway approach to the property, kind of a circuitous route to come through the property, wide enough for a carriage or a small early automobile to pass underneath, but very quickly gets superseded for its relative use on the property, and later becomes known simply as the Folly, even though it itself is older than the main house. And there's a picture of the grand estate itself. Again, quite unlike any other within the city today. Just around the corner and up the road is, through family association, another property known as the Cawthra-Elliot estate, or Lawton. With the house we had just visited, the Adamson estate was built by Agar and Mabel Adamson. Mabel was a Cawthra before marriage, and she is related to this family, and that the Adamson property was given as a gift through marriage from the Cawthra family to Mabel and her husband upon their marriage. But to get back to the Cawthras themselves, since 1808, they'd owned a piece of property that stretched from the Middle Road, or what is QW today, down to Lake Ontario, on what is the east side of Cawthra Road at that time, and they were simply known as Lot 10 concession to South Dundas Street, Lot 10 or Lawton, becoming the name they given to the property. It's nothing fancy, it's just their address. And so Lawton survives. If you go into Lawton today, the Cawthra-Elliot estate, you'll see the gateposts that say Lawton on it, and Crown Grant to Joseph Cawthra and his heirs forever, and letters patent 1804. Let that be a lesson if we carve things in stone to get it right. Whoever did the carving on it actually had the date wrong. It was not 1804. The letters patent were issued in 1808. But nonetheless, the maybe historians lament the grand house that's there today replaced an earlier house on the property, and this house was built in 1926. Kind of in a true Georgian architectural style, really befitting kind of a landed aristocratic family. Again, a grand house at its time, kind of a simple central hall plan, but nonetheless a grand home, reflecting the I don't know what the right word would be, but maybe the interesting lives of the Cawthra family and some of the parties that they like to hold, the grand gatherings, the founding meeting of the African Canada Loyalist Association, the United Empire Loyalist Association, was held there on the property in 1927. There's another early picture of Lawton or the Cawthra estate, some interior shots of the fireplace. Much more kind of humble in its look. You wouldn't, almost feels more cottagey on the inside with these historic imagery, and perhaps that was on purpose as well. There's the dining room as well. There's the estate. So the house itself is just in the middle. You can see the manicured lawns around it, including grand approaches to one to a swimming pool, the other through a maze and treed garden walkways and rose gardens and the like. Quite an extensive building. Almost none of that is evident on the property today. But of course, the house itself survives. The house, if you take a look at it on the inside, you're going to see some decorative windows that talk about the family themselves. Henry Cawthra, 1834, William, 1854, Henry again, and younger Henry, 1875. And again, this is a house that survives today and is designated under the terms of the Ontario Heritage Act. From there, we go to Riverwood, the Parker-Chappell estate, built in 1919 by Percy Parker. This house was, again, the Parkers are a wealthy family from Toronto in the Rosedale area. This became, for lack of a better word, their summer cottage. Quite an extensive property along the Credit River Valley, taking advantage of the views. And you can see just the coat of arms of England and the dates emblazoned 1919. Just something that reflects the time that the house was built and adds to kind of the imposing nature of it. There's a garden party or a wedding that took place on the property in the 1920s of Maggie Parker, and it recalls the Great Gatsby era, if you will, those grand displays of wealth. Look at the train on that wedding dress, is incredible. But there's Riverwood on the terrace side of Riverwood on the backdrop of that photograph. And there's a layout of the property itself, a servant's wing, dining rooms, kitchens, servants' bedrooms, billiards room. There's even a bedroom set aside for William Lyon Mackenzie King, Liberal Party leader and later Prime Minister, who was a personal friend of the Parker family. The hearth in the Riverwood today, above the hearth, was a mural painted by Estelle Kerr, Ida Parker's sister-in-law. Ida was the wife of Percy Parker, and it talks about the grandeur of the estate and the property itself, and right down to the two dogs that they have running around the property. Quite an extensive look at the property from a mural perspective. Again, we don't have anything quite like that in the city. Kind of this artistic impression of what this grand property would have looked like at its heyday. There's one of the historic approaches to Riverwood, the same view you get today if you approach the property today. Today, the property is home to the Riverwood Conservancy, formerly the Mississauga Garden Council, who offer and conduct the programming on the Riverwood Park. From there, we go to IALFA, Isabella and Alexander Fasken Estate. It's not really a fancy name as much as it is a collection of the letters of their names. IALFA, Isabella Alexander Fasken Estate. Built in 1921 and later became home to the Oneida Country Club. This house is no longer with us. It was quite set back in, or sorry, I'm incorrect. I jumped ahead of myself there. This house is with us today. It is a private home today off of Shawanaga. What is not with us today is the old gate post on the left there. There was a gate post on Mississauga Road, unfortunately no longer with us today, but at one point it was there and saying the words in the decorative band on the gate post saying IALFA and the Oneida Country Club. This later became the Oneida Country Club. We know Mississauga Road and the Credit River Valley being home to two golf clubs today, one being the Mississauga Golf Club, the other one being the Credit Valley Golf and Country Club. There was a third club at one point in time, and that was the Oneida Country Club. Not necessarily with golf as an association, but had horseback riding and hunting clubs and social gatherings and the like. Oneida went under in the late 1960s, and part of its property was purchased by the Mississauga Golf and Country Club and part by the Credit Valley Golf and Country Club. So very, very little reminds us of the Oneida Country Club anymore, other than just remembrances on a gate post and the house itself, the former IALFA, later becoming the clubhouse for the Oneida Country Club, still surviving as a private home today. And there's it from a distance off of Shawanaga, looking at the old Oneida Country Club home. From there we go to Cedarbank, also known as the Angus Estate. This is in the Mineola area of Mississauga, overlooking the Credit River off of Pine Tree. The house was built in 1925 as a summer estate for Charles Angus, who was in the meat business in Toronto and also involved as a member with the Mississauga Golf and Country Club. And so you have this connection and kind of geographic connections, if you will. Cedarbank is still with us today, designed by Arnold McMaster of our architectural fame, and it's entirely a private family home off of the Mineola area. Again, Cedarbank, built in 1925. And there's Cedarbank today, at least a portion of their approach today. Quite a remarkable style of home, quite unlike any other of its time. From there we go to a home known as Riverbend. I apologize, I shouldn't say Cawthra-Elliot Estate there, that's a mistake. It's the Houston Estate, Houston McDonald Estate. Riverbend was built in 1927 at the foot of Jarvis Street in Erindale Village. At one point, a private estate lands at the end of Jarvis Street. The house was relocated in the late 1960s, a slight distance away from its original location by the Carruthers family, and it still survives today as a private family home. Very similar, I guess, in kind of its massing and scale to something like Riverwood. Not quite as grand, but does really reflect on the life and times of those that build it and continue to live there. So again, Riverbend, the home of the Houston, Carruthers, and McDonald family. The house moved in the late 1960s to a point where there's a little bit of a bet that was told about moving the house and what damage it would do. And the movers said that they put a glass of water on the kitchen table and they wouldn't spill a drop. And lo and behold, that's what happened. The house happily settled onto its new foundation, and the water remained in the glass as a bet for when it was moved. And there's layout of Riverbend, called a handsome stone dwelling, built in kind of the traditional arts and crafts style, and you can still see it today, a private home within Erindale Village. From there we go to the Glen Ireton Hall, the Evans Estate, also built in 1927 by William Watson Evans. The Evans Estate, just off of the College Way, although its gatehouse is no longer with us, the main estate itself, Glen Ireton Hall, still survives, has been remodeled a few times in its history, but nonetheless surviving as a private family home. The Watson, that's right, the Evans family, William Watson Evans. And there's some historic pictures of the Glen Ireton Hall, as it was known at the time. And some more pictures that later became home to a Simpsons Company convalescent home, and then a Cistercian monastery at one point in time, and even a Solel Jewish congregation called it home. So had a number of uses right up until the 1980s, when it was converted into a restaurant, spa, and hotel venture, and still very much in that capacity today. A wonderful place to gem in our city is Glen Ireton Hall, just off of the College Way. Arcadia was built in 1929 for John Paris Bickle, one of our wealthiest people to live within the bounds of Mississauga. A J.P. Bickle Foundation was established after his passing, and that's a foundation that's still active today. There's a wing of the Children's Hospital named after J.P. Bickle, and his grand estate was befitting that of a grand man, if you will. And this was the first of the large estate homes to be built along Mississauga Road, just adjacent to the Mississauga Golf Country Club. And it really does speak to the era of the time and kind of the granddaddy of all the grand homes that come to be built in the years that follow. But the Arcadia, home to John Paris Bickle. And there's Arcadia just this past year in the winter. Quite a grand, sprawling home, complete with its own private bowling alleys, and just a remarkable home to this day. Gairloch, built in 1937, the Bell-Gairdner estate down in the southwest corner of our city, at the foot of Winston Churchill, today owned by the city of Mississauga. Gairloch was built originally by Charles Bell, and then after he passed away, his widow Kathleen Hardy remarried to James Gardner. It was not necessarily a happy marriage at the time. James eventually took an outbuilding and the name with them, and established a property in Oakville, which today is known as Gairloch Gardens. So there is a commonality through an unhappy marriage between the Gairloch in Mississauga and the Gairloch in Oakville. This remained home to Kathleen Hardy, his former wife. And if you visit the property today, you're going to see references to all the names from its history on the property, including that of James Gardner and Charles Bell. So it's just a remarkable kind of story, and architecturally, it bespeaks of kind of a French chateau style, overlooking a small pond of Joshua Creek before it empties into Lake Ontario. Just a beautiful setting, right on Lake Ontario, looking a grand home. It was empty for a number of years, but after an incredible renovation job, it's again owned by the city of Mississauga. It's open for business, and a great place to have conferences and weddings like today in a historic setting. So just stunning thing offered. Oak Ridge, the Dean Estate on Mississauga Road. Today, you can't see this from Mississauga Road. It's tucked back in, associated with Holy Name Mary Secondary School on Mississauga Road. But William George Dean was the VP of the Eaton's Company, and we'd already met Robert Young Eaton a little bit earlier. Well, this is the next generation down. And William George Dean was the VP of Eaton's in the 1920s and 1930s, and later taken over by the Felician Sisters as a convent. And so quite a kind of a remarkable, if hidden story from the geographic landscape, because you just can't see it from the road, but just a remarkable property. Quite a stunning architectural, built solidly of stone. Then we go to the castle. How many people have driven by this on Mississauga Road and raised an eyebrow or been fascinated with what it looks like inside? But a grand home that didn't start out quite as grand. There's a picture in the bottom left of what it looked like in its original formation before dreams and fantasy and curiosity and architectural styles started to run a little rampant, and they created something that is absolutely breathtaking and unique in the city of Mississauga. Originally built in the 1930s, in the 1950s into early 1960s, the house was remodeled several times to the appearance it has today as a castle. A private family home throughout its history is absolutely remarkable. Has a winding staircase and secret doors and the like. Even a ballroom inside for grand hosting of parties. So really, really remarkable. Athol Bray, designed in 1938 by David Lee, a vineyard merchant and investor. Lee and Hamilton families in Port Credit are quite connected, but Athol Bray survives as a private family home today. And even its former outbuilding or garage, which you can see in the bottom right picture there, it survives today as well, even though it's no longer on the property of the main house itself. But Athol Bray, again, solid stone construction in the medieval area, built in 1838. And there's some pictures of Athol Bray, just, in a way astounding. It's such a beautiful home. Becomes just a landmark in our community, and beautifully cared for to this day. That's going to be the end of our presentation today, and I hope you've enjoyed the look at historic houses in Mississauga, the old estate homes, mind your manners, or the relics of old decency, things that really connect to our landscape and the past people and times. We have a remarkable story. We have remarkable histories here. Some of those buildings are still with us, but in the idea that perhaps a future drive around Mississauga, you won't quite look at things the exact same way again. And that's the plan here. That's if you're curious about something, if you're wondering why something is named as such, let us know. Send in your questions, send in your curiosities, and we'll look to answer them on our weekly Ask a Historian session, but also in terms of future presentations. So thank you so much, and take care, and we'll see you next time. Thank you. From Heritage Mississauga, I'm Matthew Wilkinson, historian.